All right, so now let's get into how muscles kind of, I guess we say, feed themselves, getting into their metabolism. So we'll talk about different energy sources for different exercises and intensities, kind of what we use first, and how we go through our different sources until they're depleted. Talk about how we get ATP, different muscle fibers, right, and so on and so forth in terms of how do muscles actually get the energy they need to do all this? Because as you can imagine, what we were talking about, there's so much ATP being used. Every single time myosin needs to grab onto actin and let go, we need to go through an ATP molecule. So this is like super energetically expensive compared to other things that we go into, right? And so we got to go into how muscles how do they get all this ATP that they need? All right, so let's go ahead and talk about this. So the primary energy source for muscle tissue depends on the intensity. If it's rest and mild exercise, right, we're using aerobic respiration, things like glucose, things like fatty acids. A lot of the fatty acids that are found in the blood, right, is the thing. So it's not just fatty acids, but also where we find them. We're finding that we use a lot of them from the blood, and then some glucose and some triglycerides from the muscle. Right, and again, this is mild exercise. Up to, we're looking at 0 to 30 minutes, right? This here is talking about the percentage. So we're looking at, I think there's a 10, each line is 10%. So just like 12% coming from glucose, most of it coming from plasma fatty acids in the blood, and then another about 10-11% coming from triglycerides. As we increase the intensity of the exercise, though, we then start to use glycogen stores in the muscle. That becomes the main thing. With a higher percentage of muscle triglycerides, we see that we have a huge drop in the plasma fatty acids as well as plasma glucose. And then heavy exercise, this is where we're relying on the glycogen in the muscles primarily. We're using some triglycerides, but the big thing that you notice is that the shift that we see from mild to moderate to heavy is going from things that are free floating in the blood to things that we have stored in the muscle, right? So blood source first is, like this almost 90%. Then we see it drop down to about 36%, drop down to under 30%. Is going to be things we find in the bloodstream versus things we find in the muscle. So the way we get the ATP from all of these things, we have 3 different pathways we can use. We have the creatine phosphate pathway, also called the CP pathway. This is something unique to muscle cells. We don't see this pathway everywhere. We also have anaerobic glycolysis, also known as fermentation. This is going to produce some ATP, but also lactic acid. It's not very efficient compared to the last one, which is cellular respiration, where we can make large amounts of ATP it's very efficient to make. This is the one, though, that requires oxygen, the cellular respiration, so we can only use it under particular circumstances where oxygen is readily available. So let's start with the creatine phosphate pathway. This is using the enzyme creatine kinase. So if we look at what we are doing here, right, we have creatine coming from the liver. Creatine supplements also can be used to artificially increase this, but you shouldn't use that all the time. It's not really healthy to overuse supplements like that. But what we see is when we have that creatine, we can use ATP to create creatine phosphate. We go through that process. Creatine phosphate then, right, can be used by contracting muscles, right, to produce ATP. It's a very fast pathway. Very, very, very quick, but it's not as effective, or not, I should say, not as efficient, right? So it's very effective at making ATP fast. It's not very effective at making ATP cheaply. Creatine kinase, we can look at this and find this in the blood, basically to see if someone is having certain conditions, like if they're having a heart attack, if they have muscular dystrophy, rhabdomyolysis, which is a dangerous breakdown of muscle condition. So when we find creatine kinase in like the blood, this tells us that we probably have damaged muscles, because some of the forms of creatine kinase can be released. So like CKMM is going to be released by skeletal muscles when they get damaged too much. And then CKMB gets released by heart muscles, right? Rhabdomyolysis, this is where like we see a bunch of CK in the blood because we're literally seeing the muscle cells break down, like, and it's acute, so it's happening. This is not good, right? This is a very bad place to be, is rhabdomyolysis. The muscle's literally being destroyed, and so it's spilling the creatine kinase into the blood that we can detect. So we can use that when we have very little oxygen. And we can continue using the fermentation pathway when we don't have enough oxygen as well. Right, we can go through glycolysis, and then rather than go into the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, we can, and the ETC, we can go into the fermentation side instead. We get about a few minutes of this. So this is, again, another thing where we can make ATP relatively quickly, but it's not good in terms of long-term sustainability. We get about 2 minutes of an energy reserve with that. Whereas aerobic conditions, we do have a lot of oxygen, and so we can use aerobic or cellular respiration. This is where we then can go through glycolysis, right? We can enter into the Krebs cycle, we can go through the ETC, and we can make a lot more ATP for the same amount of glucose or the same amount of fuel, right, compared to the other two. And so this gives us several minutes to even hours of energy reserve. We can do this long term, which is why you generally see people, they can sprint for a short distance. So you can run at your absolute maximum for a short while, but you can't sprint an entire marathon, right? Because you just don't have the sufficient oxygen amount being delivered to the tissues to sustain that sort of sprint, right? So something you notice, like, it's a little bit slower, but in terms of the production, but it is much more sustainable compared to the other processes. But different types of muscle do best with different, they kind of focus on different pathways. In terms of how fast they fatigue, and in terms of how, like, what their metabolic rate is, or what their metabolic requirements are. So red muscle fibers are slow twitch fibers. They're called this because they have a lot of myoglobin, and remember, myoglobin is going to help store oxygen. So this is slow twitch. We see this in like the chicken thighs, like in the dark meat of a chicken. Because it has the myoglobin and the capillary supply, it is darker in color, and it can store more oxygen. Whereas with white muscle fibers or fast twitch, they don't have as much myoglobin, they don't have the same capillary supply. This is white meat. This is going to be more fast twitch. They're also going to vary not just in their myoglobin content, but also the mitochondria that are available. With the fast twitch having fewer mitochondria and the slow twitch having more. Now, which one? We also have the intermediate. This is another fast twitch, where we're kind of in between the red and the white muscle fibers. And so same thing, medium amount of myoglobin, medium number of mitochondria. Which ones we see where depends on what the body part is, right? What kind of action does it do? Where do we find that muscle? And then, of course, we also see differences in terms of if someone has been training for something, have they been training for a marathon versus have they been training as a sprinter? And then genetics as well can play a role in that. But generally speaking, no muscle is made up of just like one muscle fiber. It's a mixture, right? There's all three muscle fibers that we find in every individual, like in the muscle of somebody, like in like their thigh or in their arm or whatever. Like we find all three muscle fiber types in general. It's just which ones are kind of more common than the others. That being said, though, a motor unit is generally going to be innervating all the same type of muscle fibers, right? And so here we see like the smaller motor unit with the smaller force. These guys can contract quickly and they don't really fatigue. That would be the slow twitch. And then as we move down the line from slow twitch, oxidative to fast oxidative glycolytic, right? That's like our medium, and then fast glycolytic, that's going to be our fast twitch. We see that we can do maximum load, but we fatigue very quickly. So again, slow twitch fibers, these guys, they are also called type 1 muscle fibers. These guys, they don't have as much power, but they can endure for a long time, so they can sustain that contraction. They can contract over and over again without the fatigue setting in as much. And they can do that because they rely on aerobic respiration, which produces a lot of ATP per individual glucose molecule, and they have a lot of mitochondria to do it. They have a lot of myoglobin, which helps with that oxygen store. And then because of that, they're generating a lot of ATP, right? They're generating a lot of ATP. It's not as fast of a process because we have the ETC and all that. But we can generate ATP over a longer period of time very consistently. Whereas the fast glycolytic fibers, these are the fast twitch or type 2, they are very powerful. So if you're doing something quick and strong, like lifting a weight like this guy is in the bottom here, or running, sprinting the 100-meter dash or whatever, they're very powerful, but they fatigue a lot faster, right? So more power, less sustained. Reason being, they don't have as much myoglobin, which means not as much oxygen being stored. They don't have as many mitochondria. They have more glycogen storages instead, and so we find this in strength-related muscles in higher numbers. And they're using anaerobic processes, generally speaking, to produce ATP. So they are going to be using things like CP or fermentation. And then lastly, the intermediate ones, the fast oxidative glycolytic fibers. These ones are in between, so they're kind of called type 2A because they're in between the two. They have, again, an intermediate amount of myoglobin and mitochondria, so they can use either glycolysis or cell respiration and kind of float between the two. And if we look up here, we actually see all three, right? They're kind of color-coded. So here is our fast glycolytic one. This is our fast twitch. Here's our slow oxidative or our slow twitch, and then here's our fast oxidative glycolytic, which is intermediate. And you can even see the color, right? So fast is going to be white, intermediate is like this beige, and then our slow twitch is like this deeper brown. I will just let you pause here to read through this. Doesn't make a lot of sense for me to read a table to you, but if you'd like to read this table, please do pause, look through it, and understand it. It's just talking about the different features, so kind of comparing a lot of the things we just talked about, the size, fatigue, myoglobin content, right, twitch rate, where we find them, and then the different types of muscle fibers from the slow twitch to the intermediate to the fast twitch.